Going to record.
Okay, it's 3:20. It's 3:20, so I'm going to ask you to finish your conversation. We have 15 minutes. I told it was a hard stop and a hard start and a hard stop. So I'm going to follow both of those things. And I'm going to ask you to hold any questions you might have till the end. And I'm also going to ask you not to be on your phone while I'm lecturing. And so welcome everybody. My name's Diane Pike. I teach in the sociology department. I've been in faculty development in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning my entire career, in part thanks to Norma Noonan. Last year I had a chapter in this book called Learning from Each Other by University of California Press. There's a lot more stuff in here, but I'm going to use my 15 minutes to talk about some specific things related to that. You should have a pen, you should have the outline, and you should have the bookmark, and Tim's in charge of those things. I have three goals that I would like to accomplish in the time today. One, I would like to share with you some of what the research says about lecturing. I'm going to make some suggestions for practice with relationship to lecturing. And I realize that with the practice stuff, I kind of don't mean it personally, but if it applies to you personally, then I want you to take it personally. Okay? And then I am going to try to model what the research talks about. So you can do your meta-analysis thing here, because it's pretty bold to walk around and lecture about telling people how to lecture and not try to do the things that you're supposed to do. I have two things to clarify at the beginning. First of all, that I'm talking about interactive lecturing, which has been around for a really long time. If you happen to be on more than one occasion talking nonstop for 70 minutes or 100 minutes, with all due respect, you need to stop. And so when we talk about lecturing now, we talk about interactive lecture where what some people in education call didactic instruction is interspersed with activities and things that break it up. So when I say lecture, I mean interactive lecture within that. It is still the modal pedagogy in higher education, despite active learning, or in addition to active learning, or in addition to the attack that there's been on lecture for the last 5 to 10 years within that. Okay? This attack of the last sort of 5 to 7 years has come from a number of places. And the first thing I'd want to say is that this is not new. It is cyclical, right? We have gone down the active learning road many times before. But what's happened recently is we've had celebrity people, Nobel Prize winners and physicists at Harvard, who've decided that lecture is a bad thing. They get all kinds of attention. If you follow the Chronicle, they talk about lecturing as academic bloodletting. They talk about how it's dead. They talk about, Eric Mazer talks about how it's unethical to lecture. And there's just been this long kind of tirade about lecture as this morally corrupt thing that people do. So the title of this is, King is dead, long live the lecture. The chapter is entitled Without Apology, Reclaiming the Lecture. And so that's part of what motivates this work. We can lecture effectively, or we can lecture less effectively. Just like if you would like me to put you in a meaningless small group, I would be happy to do that. And so what I want to talk about today in presenting these two ideas and making these suggestions for practice is how we might do that better. I have never met a faculty member who didn't have a rationale or a justification for what they do in class. The problem is having a rationale doesn't mean it works. And so we really need to look at this systematically. And that's why I made the bookmarks for you. Stephen Brookfield is at the University of St. Thomas. He has a wonderful book called The Critically Reflective Practitioner, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen it. And I have this bookmark at the top of my monitor, okay? And so you're a smart audience. That's pretty self-evident for that, okay? So I'd like to start by asking you to turn to the person next to you. And you have a choice here right? You can either tell them something you think you do pretty well when you lecture, what's the strength when you lecture, or you can talk to them about, here's something I think I don't do very well when I lecture. You get to pick, and you got 15 seconds. Okay, 5 seconds, 5 more seconds. Okay, can you finish your thought? Can you finish your sentence? All right, so you're younger than I am, so see if you could remember what you just talked about till the end of the 15 minutes, okay? And we're gonna try to return to this then. So I'd like you to look at the handout that I gave you. And one of the things that I use a lot, and my spiel on PowerPoint is an entirely different presentation, but one of the things that we know is that lecture guides, particularly when it's a more content-heavy lecture or when you need to be lecturing and you are lecturing for the right reasons, lecture guides can be really helpful. If Dal was absent from class and he got this sheet from somebody, it's not going to help him, right? He needs to be here to fill it in. But it helps structure it, and it helps structure me. But it also means I don't have a slide up here that I am turning towards half the time and reading to the audience, right? So the lecture guide, I invite you to take notes. The research is really clear that taking notes is a form of active listening. We can also have the conversation about laptop versus handwriting, but you do what you want within all of that. And so on your handout it says there are 4 dimensions of lecture. That's one of the things that I talk about in the chapter. And so we can talk about the lecturer. We can talk about the lecture itself. We can talk about the process of delivering it. And we can talk about the audience, the lectured, the people who are being lectured to or lectured with. And I'm going to talk today about 2 of these. I'm going to talk, which 2 am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about the lecture itself, right? And I'm going to talk about the lecturer, okay? Because we have a limited amount of time, and I hope that this will be the most helpful. So if we talk about the lecture itself, what does the research tell us and what might it mean for our practice? Well, no surprise, lecture works really well when it's the right strategy for the learning goal that you have. Lecture works really well when it's the right strategy for the learning goal that you have. And I'm going to presume that most of you try to change things up. You don't do the same thing every time, every day. But it took me a long time before I realized that I was sometimes changing stuff up to change it up. And I wasn't explicitly saying, given what I want them to learn, is lecture the right pedagogy for me to use here, okay? And it took me a long time to try to think about that. We know that we talk about things like, what do I want to cover? And it's not about coverage, and it's not about learning. But trying to think about what lecture is good for, or didactic instruction is good for, is important. Right? The research tells us a couple of things. One of the things it tells us is that lecture is actually quite effective for transmitting information. If there are things that you want people to understand, right, it's a good way to do that. It works pretty well. Lectures also particularly effective pedagogy for creating interest, okay, more so than some of the other pedagogies we have available. People can tell stories. We're like, totally enamored of stories these days. You can use things to inspire people and to create interest. The research also shows that lecture is a good strategy to use when you want to promote understanding. In other words, a good lecturer and good lecturer can model cognitive processes, right? It can provide context to things, and it can be a very effective way to do it. Lecture's not, and I'm sure you know this, lecture's not a good way to teach skills, right? But I don't always sit down and say, is this a skill? Is this content knowledge? Whatever, okay? If that's true, right, that lecture is good for these things, then my other argument about this is if you're gonna lecture, then content is king or queen or prince or whatever you want to fill in there, right? The most important thing about an effective lecture is the content. Do I know what I'm talking about, and am I talking about something that matters? All right, so when you're looking at your preps for your classes and in terms of going to suggestions for practice, right, one of the things that I do sometimes is I look at an outline for a class and I try to write in the margins actually sort of what is the goal with this, and should this really be the video, or should this really be the small group discussion, or should this be the activity? And unless you are always already doing that, I'm lecturing because this is the right strategy for today, then I think that's a really helpful thing that comes from the literature. The second thing that I want to talk about is lecturer. And no doubt you can, I'm going to talk, I'm looking at this clock, I have like 6 minutes. Okay, I started late anyway. I'm going to tell you about things where I'm sure you're going to say, but I know a fantastic teacher and none of these things apply to them, okay? And that's great, but that's not how social science works, right? We're not going to build this ship based on the outliers. We're going to build this ship based on what we know for the patterns. And so when we look at the research, there are things that we know that matter in all areas of life, but they also matter in the classroom, all right? And those things are gender, age, race, and ethnicity. Now, most of us here probably don't need me or the research to say that those things matter, and I'm going to talk specifically about gender. But I would also argue that I don't think most of us think about gender explicitly in the way that we teach. We know it matters, but how does it shape your practice within that? All of them interact collectively as well, right? There's an intersectionality about that. But these characteristics matter in both positive and negative ways. We know gender is a factor in student responses, and that male students, right, have preferences for male faculty. So you might say, okay, I know that, and I'm going to say to you, and how does it affect your practice? What do you do with that? It's also true that female students prefer male faculty. And what are you doing with that? So one of the consequences of that, I think, for practice is to actually think about your physical presence in the classroom. You can't change your gender or sexual identity. You can't change your age, heaven knows. But you can think about why that matters. I was 28 when I started here, and Chuck Anderson, bless his heart, every 6 months would stop me in the quad and say, what year are you? Because I was 6 years older than many of our students. That is one of the reasons I dress the way that I do, right? I was young, I was female, I needed to not look like a student. I have to have examples, right, that would not suggest to them that I was born before the First World War or some other way that they think that that's old, okay? And so our physical presence, and you can have good data on the characteristics of a lecturer, but we need to step back and say, then how am I gonna adjust, accommodate, think about that when I'm lecturing to my students, okay? So what I'd like you to do, we have 2 minutes left, is to turn back to the person that you just talked to, and given either the things about the lecture or the things about the lecturer, when you think about what you did well or wish you did better, which of these factors might be relevant? So when you go back to your example, is anything that you do well because of your age or your gender or your content? Right, take a minute and see what you can share with your partner. Let's take 20 seconds.
Yeah. So I started doing
Okay, I'm going to ask you to stop because I want to be respectful of your time, which is also true in lecture. You should start and stop on time. And the last thing I want to call your attention to is the conclusion from the chapter that I put on the handout. And it wasn't just to show off so I could reference the Queen of Hearts or use the term Pyrrhic victory correctly, but because I want you to not be afraid to think about lecture as a tool that's really important, and then to also step back and think about lecture with the same strategies and critical thinking that we apply to the other areas of our teaching and to our research in general. So with that, it's time for the faculty meeting, and thank you very much.